So I have the unbelievable privilege of being the president of the Bezos Family Foundation. Where we're housed in Seattle, Washington, in the States. Foundation was constructed about 20 years ago from Mike and Jackie Bezos, who are the mother and father of Jeff, Mark, and Christina Bezos, and that forms the board. And joined a little over a year and a half ago. And the foundation exists to facilitate good in the world in a very, very specific way. And our moniker is a tandem bike. We choose the back seat, where we just try to power others who are leading and doing the work. And we work very hard at that. So I'll say a little bit about the foundation in 2 or 3 sentences, and then 2 or 3 sentences about the shift that we're leading and making, and that shift is intention in what's happening in a lot of philanthropy, at least in the States. And so Foundation has historically and continues to have 3 pillars of work, and each pillar is driven by a question that we want to know more about. The first pillar is the work around early childhood and young youth. That work is a good chunk of the majority of the opportunity we have to make investments, and that work is basically a baby's first 1,000 days, and mother and father parenting adult health and well-being. And so how does a family transition to successful parenting, and how is a baby's health and a parent's health ensure that down the road they'll enter community and education in a place to be an opportunity to be both healthy and successful. And those investments are from prenatal, perinatal, postnatal brain development, health, opportunity, preparation for education, mom health, dad health, and that type of work. That work is domestic in the U.S. and international, with a pretty proud set of investments here on the continent. There are investments in other places around the world, but our greatest concentration is in Africa and a number of countries. I'll talk about that in a moment. The second pillar is research. That's medical and non-medical research. A lot dealing with the first thing I talked about, which was early childhood and early stage life of young people, as well as adolescent. That is brain development, the opportunity of taking science, real facts, which I loved the previous session we were just in, and how do we translate that for use in the world. And lots of investments in major research universities, education, schools of education, and the like. The third pillar is adolescent, and adolescent, in this case, leadership development. And how do we invest in the young people, develop their voice, develop the skills of leadership, because they are absolutely, I think, already ready to lead in this world and to capitalize on that. And that, again, brings us to this continent, which I'll talk about in a second, some of our specific investments. And the last, which is like, I'm almost nervous to say that, is AI, and AI education adjacent. So the things that touch a young person's life, like the communities of transportation and medicine and health, et cetera, around those pieces. This one, like our other ones, we develop with a question, and so we don't just like invest in just like AI. We're very, very interested when we set this pillar up in trying to understand the relationship that a young person has with an adult and an AI entity. And what is happening there around that. We're very curious about that. So in a school, you have, basically the teacher and the curriculum and the young scholar, and you introduce AI and what's going on there. We want to understand that. So that's kind of the pillars. We have an incredible privilege of being invited in a number of places on the continent here. We have investments in young, amazing young people's leadership here in South Africa, an African Leadership Academy, in Rwanda, in Afghan School for Girls, when they left Afghanistan, when Taliban came back into power, and now are set up in Kigali. We have a large initiative in most of North Africa, what we call the Stevens Initiative, which is building the voice and leadership of the whole current generation of young people, next leaders in their countries. And then substantial set of investments in West Africa, in countries like Malawi and Nigeria, and Niger and Cote d'Ivoire. And that is, a lot of that is helping young girls persist in their education. So that's, basically what we do. How we do that is where I'd like to spend a little bit of a time thinking about this publicly with you all. So we definitely, at least in kind of, I would say, the United States, there's been this strong and long history of philanthropy. And in short, I mean, it goes back to kind of ancient times, which is tithing and alms and giving, and kind of a long history of that. Then comes the history of patronage, mostly known with the arts, where we invest in people who are able to then create art and other pieces. And then, as America experienced this era of robber barons, then came along a rather famous work called the Gospel of Wealth. And in that really began this era, what we call, of strategic philanthropy. And I will summarize with personal view, and that was the ultra-wealthy, we know it's best for the rest of the world, and we're going to direct our funding there with how we think it should be spent, and then bring the program to you and your life will be better. I'm sure there are other ways to say that, but you can read the Gospel for Wealth, which is very difficult to read these days in the way that the language was done, that really the non-wealthy or the poor don't know what's best for them, but the wealthy do, and we'll give our money and do that. And so when that strategic philanthropy began, it had a number of eras. One was philanthrocapitalism. We'll build buildings and put our names on them. Public library system of America is a good example. Almost can't go to a hospital in the United States without the wing being named after this person or that person. Or if you go to the arts in a place like New York City and you want to go to Lincoln Center, there's a name on every corner of the building and every venue inside of that. Then came an era of philanthroactivism, whereas we actually want to fund things to happen. Education in the past 20 years is a very good example in the United States, where a kind of activist approach that we actually think, I keep using we in the global, that, for example, charter schools are really the best thing to transform public education. So a lot of money goes into that around these pieces. There are other forms of that which are also equally powerful. We think parent voice is incredibly important, so build a lot of organizations that lift up parent voice to demand a better education. Those type of pieces. All pretty much the kind of generations of what we would call strategic philanthropy. When I had this opportunity, I think that there are things we can learn from that, but I have definitely led in a way, and so have some others, to think that there is a real opportunity to approach this as what we would call empowerment philanthropy, which takes its belief that whomever is in need of support knows best what they need. And so individuals living in circumstances of challenge or peril or poverty know exactly what they need, and probably more so than the philanthropy would ever know what they need. And so the arrogance of rolling up into town, especially looking in the way I present, as a white man of unearned privilege and expecting the community to say, I've got the solution for you, does not sit well in the notion of how to best support a community. In empowerment philanthropy, the investment is constructed together. And that actually, I think, acknowledges the dignity of individuals, the dignity of a community, and that is done with local entities. So we get the opportunity to fund local entities to do that. And in the US right now, there's a lot of our work is based in supporting the improvements as the local entity sees it in indigenous, First Native, Native American communities, rural America, the Deep South, where if you just take a look at one example, the fact of a black woman in the United States and a white woman in the United States both giving birth, there is 9 times more chance that there will be complications and even fatality for a black woman in the United States around that piece. And so understanding that local piece and then working with communities like, for example, birth doulas is a good example of what we're doing there. And then having an invitation to come here, for example, in Africa, and working to understand how we can support things like leadership for young people, like health for young girls and moms, like the conditions for that. Persistence in education requires 10 times more listening than doing, and then finding the local entity that is trusted and investing in that. That, in a nutshell, is what we're trying to do and the theory of how we're trying to do that.
Okay, there were 2 things you mentioned when I was speaking to you earlier, which you've touched upon in terms of invitation, when you say the privilege of being able to work in Africa from these invitations. But the second side of that was you said your challenge in finding people to work with. So I'd like you to touch upon that, because people also don't know how to find you.
Okay.
So they have to find you to know that they present their problem to you. But also there are philanthropists who are proximate to these problems, who are either not being tapped, don't know how to come to the aid of those that need philanthropic capital, but somehow you are able to find them and be invited. So can you touch upon the privilege and the lack of partnerships that you speak about?
First of all, it is a privilege. It's amazing. I mean, youth everywhere are amazing, like just full stop. It just brings joy and hope and encouragement in my life every time I get to meet with young people. There is something, however, uniquely amazing around the spirit of resilience and hope and entrepreneurship that I experience when I get to talk with the youth side by side on the continent here. That is so incredibly inspiring that I just deeply love that. So one difference might be that it's relatively easier in the States when we want to invest in a community to find the entities that are doing the work, because there is a general ability to have a registry to know who's doing this work. And it is our method. We don't ever make an investment just by ourselves. And so we want to tap local, ultra-high wealth individuals, local philanthropies, to be a side-by-side partner with that. That is a little bit more tricky here in locating those individuals. It's not that they don't exist. The ability, we have a tax form called the 990, where you can find all of the individuals who are giving money and all of the foundations for doing that relatively easy. That is a great opportunity for growth and partnership outside of the US here. And then the second thing I might say is there are certainly some structures in the US, don't copy everything by any means, given the current political climate. But there are incentives built into the tax code for individuals to give their money away, and then there's a way of recording that. So it's easier to find those types of partners around that. Good example in your home country and some others. We have found the opportunity for government to be that side-by-side person. If we're making investments, government will match it. That is wonderful. That really helps. We don't like to do things alone. We don't mind incenting, but large, big bets, which we've been making, I might consider a big bet. The development of youth leadership across North Africa, places like Afghan School for Girls. A year ago, I had the opportunity to be here, which was extraordinary, and one of the presenters was an astonishingly amazing woman by the name of Navin Salam. And if you remembered, she was trying to really get her hands around eliminating early childhood and baby malnutrition and starvation, and developed a product. And so a big bet that family made was to super catalyze her work with an enormous gift, and now she is being able to do that across the world. We just made another big bet this year, which I'm incredibly proud of, which was some people I think are familiar with the Aspen Institute, and so developing, standing up, and endowing in perpetuity what we call the Center for Rising Generations, which will build, program, support existing programming, and develop new programs to raise, lift, and develop adolescent and young leader voice domestically and globally around that. Both were enormous investments, and they're bets in leaders and bets, in this case, in youth.
So I don't want to pick on anyone. I don't want to pick on your principal. I don't want to pick on Bill Gates, but there are three stories I have.
I work for the Bezos family.
Yes. You work for Bezos, so that's true. So the first one is, I had the opportunity to present to some investors in Seattle not too long ago, and
there's a few there.
There are a few billionaires there.
Yes.
And in needing to ferry between the different locations and where I was presenting and where I was staying, I was there for about 3 weeks.
Oh.
I was very challenged about walking on the streets in Seattle, because I actually felt less safe than I would feel on the streets of Lagos. There's homelessness, drugs, and so on. So at some point during one of my presentations, I literally said, I'm not sure you should be giving money to me to take it to Africa. You might want to look in your own background.
Yeah.
The second story I want to tell is, I remember...
And I also would comment that actually those conditions are also not just germane to Seattle.
No, absolutely. I'm going somewhere with this.
Okay.
The second one is a clip I saw when during many of Bill Gates' visits to Nigeria over the last decade and some, and this one in particular for a famous wedding of one of his fellow billionaires, and he stuck out like a sore thumb amongst all this lavishness. And I was wondering if he was speaking to his fellow billionaire about how he could solve proximate problems and not wait for people like Bill Gates to come and solve problems like malaria at the time Bill was focused on. And he looked uncomfortable, and I was wondering whether, on the one hand, I felt, okay, something's going to happen. We're going to have more local philanthropy. That didn't happen. Yesterday, we heard about some drawback from dollars going into malaria, some of that because the big pockets and donors that have been working in that, including Bill Gates, have moved back a little, even though they continue to fund. And so it then becomes a case of something gets deprioritized because certain oligarchs or philanthropists decide that's not an area they want to go into. The third thing is that, interestingly, as we were having that session, Bill Gates was actually in Abuja yesterday working on some other stuff. And so obviously he's moved on to something bigger. So, 2 questions. How do we, you've mentioned about the things we need to do on the regulatory side, but what else can we do to get domestic philanthropists involved in proximate problems? The second one is, what do you do when those that have been investing in these very important areas move away and you still don't have that domestic capital coming to the table?
And I think this is an incredibly important question, and it's an incredibly important point. And so I'm not going to speak for anybody but myself. And I want to say a couple of things. The observations you made about many of the seemingly intractable problems in the United States are very real. The unhoused, the addicted, the disenfranchised are very, very, very serious problems. Education is another one of those issues. And not recently, but certainly very, very publicly in the last half a decade or so, the seeming inability for Americans to have a civil conversation over difference. So one thought that I would offer is it's very important to understand that actually, the great point I would tack this to was yesterday's presentation about how long it took to develop a vaccine for malaria. And you have to be persistent in that if you are going to get a breakthrough. And social dilemmas, you've got to be very mindful that it takes a long time with frequent missteps. But if you walk away from that, you actually won't be able to make the dent you want around that. So I think of a quote that guides me and guides the foundation from Martin Luther King, and I might misspeak, but the notion of that doing the work and understanding that there'll be finite disappointments can never overshadow the fact you have to have infinite hope and patience to do the right thing. So one of the things that we see is, at least the way we look at this and the way I would look at this, is think long and hard, not too long because there's need, but think long and hard before you begin an investment, that you've got to stay for the long haul around that piece. As a sector, we have to stay for the long haul around that piece. That is very tough to get people, because fundamentally people can do what they want with their money. That is absolutely a given. But if we choose to serve, there is as much a consequence to thinking about the right intermediaries to get the opportunities that we hope for to come to fruition, or impact as we call it, as there is to walk away from it when you start it. And I have to say that I think the only way to answer your question is be very solid in your North Star as to what's going to guide you. Then there is the opportunity to be informed by those who you are working with. And if you listen carefully, you will begin to understand that this is for the long haul.
Yeah. And I want to turn it over to the audience to ask a couple of questions before we continue. But the stat I want to put out there is that when we talk about the disparity and the absence of proximate capital to these problems, in the US, I think it's something like 2% of GDP that is philanthropic capital. In Africa, on average, maybe it's about 0.1%. So the opportunity is huge, and when we think about the problems we're all talking about, that is capital that just needs to come alongside other capital so that we can stop going hand in cap to foreign capital. The work that I do in impact investing, I almost overwhelmingly only get money from foreign development finance institutions who are using their taxpayers' money, your taxpayers' money, to solve problems in my country. And so we need more of that to increase. So the way I want to hand it over is, are there any ideas from the audience, other than the ones that we've spoken about, in tax incentives, vehicles, appropriate vehicles, that can help solve this problem? So, is there a mic? Anyone? We have a hand here.
I don't have ideas about tax incentives or anything like that, but what I'd like to share is that I'm with Corporate Foundation Financial Services, and we had a program, so there's a tradition in South Africa called stokvels, which is basically low-income communities across the country coming together to for savings, but it's very subsistence-based savings. So everyone's grandmother, uncle, etc. belong to a stokvel, but usually it's reasonably small amounts of money, and then there's a payout to an individual, once a year. So we had an idea for financial inclusion and just focusing on the S and ESG to see how it is that we could experiment with the model of stokvels. And that's not the focus of my contribution here. I wanted to say that while we were helping the stokvel members formalize and really exponentially increase their revenues by various means, what we found completely unprovoked, completely unrequested from ourselves, is that every single one of these stokvels was doing something in terms of in their communities. And these are not wealthy people. These are lower middle class or working class people. So for example, there was a group of gentlemen who they call the Divine Brotherhood. And what they did is that at the same time, what they would do is go and speak on GBV to young boys in either primary school and in secondary school. There was another one, a woman-only stokvel, and what they did is that they started a food garden, urban food garden, where anyone in the community should go and feed themselves. And like I'm saying, these are not wealthy people, but that's philanthropy. And just because it's not termed philanthropy doesn't mean it's not. And so I think that when we talk about philanthropy and the stats that you gave, I think there's a whole lot of activities that are happening spontaneously, organically, that are not captured in the data and the research that are happening all the time. And I think that we have to find smarter ways of maybe connecting the dots and maybe doing what these people are doing anyway at bigger scale to really solve problems which they are very proximate to, because it's in their communities and they know those issues, and that's why they specifically address those issues. So I just wanted to say, I think in the African context, I think we have to be a lot more broad-minded when we speak about philanthropy, and who a philanthropist is not going to be a billionaire in the African context. Yeah.
And that's a very important point, because there's significant informal philanthropy, and I totally acknowledge that, and we need to amplify that. The other side of it for me is representation, because when you have big philanthropy dollars, that can also motivate and inspire others who are proximate, who are not just about, the small informal, but middle class, the burgeoning middle class that we speak about, and consumerism that we speak about in Africa, that can also play a role. So how do we also have the vehicles that enable us to mop up some of that to direct to proximate problems, for sure?
I want to offer two comments. Deeply appreciate what you said, and one of the things that goes through my mind, both at home, possibly here, is how does a community or a country raise that narrative so that others know about that, whether either storytelling or in other forms, because there's such honor in that. And then the second thing is, I'll touch on, it's seemingly controversial in the US at the moment, is the notion of guaranteed basic income. And there's a number of pilots and experiments that have gone on with that. One of the pieces that the research has shown mirrors what you just said, and that is when an individual or a family has a reasonably stable and predictable form of income, they engage in other activities which are both community and family empowering and advancing around that. That, I think, is really worth us understanding around that societal. And I'll own it back at home. And the idea that family who has a stable and predictable income, not large, but stable and predictable, who's not like one breakdown of a vehicle from losing employment, attends more activities with their child at school. The child at school is actually attending more faithfully. Health increases because they're able to get to those type of things. So those ancillary and collateral opportunities from that are really, really, really important.
So John, I really like your thought on empowerment philanthropy, which is really very much welcome. My question is, what we have been hearing over so many years when it comes to education and health is that the approach brings together women and children in the same box. And we normally hear the vulnerable ones, women and children, repeatedly in literature, reports, data, etc. So my question is, how do you see this empowerment philanthropy in that new light where if you change that narrative, you will tell women completely another reality, which is, it's not that you are vulnerable by definition, it's that the system make you vulnerable. It's different from children. Can we rethink that narrative in a way that we are going to be, let's say, much more effective in the way that we bring aid to these women?
John, can I ask that we take the other two and then you take
Oh,
all
sure.
three together?
Oh, gosh.
So,
That requires keeping a track.
yeah.
Hey, a question I'm trying to answer for myself, but I'll ask you to help me answer it. So, you know, working with youth and making an impact on education makes us feel good, and you more or less said that. But if you look at the macro, our choice of leadership, the quality of the streets of downtown America and other cities throughout the world appears to be in decline. At what point do you know that this 2% of GDP, and I think it's probably more going into all of these initiatives, is actually making an impact and getting us kind of in a better direction? Because we're spending a lot of time, I think, and a lot of heart trying to change the trajectory, and yet there's no real signs that it actually changes the overall situation.
Thanks. And then there was just one there.
Thanks, John. I'd like to pick up on one of the points you made, which is one of the best uses of philanthropic money is to actually help with government and government policy. In my experience, the most successful sort of philanthropic endeavor in the research space was during COVID, when we were able to raise a lot of money very quickly with collaborative arrangements between scientists and social scientists across sort of many different countries. In South Africa, that made a huge difference to our lockdown regulations and how we moved from level 5 to level 4 to 3 to 1. And there's a lot of learning that comes out of that. But the idea, what was so powerful then, was that that money was able to immediately impact government policy. So the question that I'd like to know is, why is this not the litmus test of all philanthropy, which is every success story needs to be evaluated by the philanthropic organization itself to see what can be generalized so that other countries can learn, because then you leverage more than just your expenditure, more than just the governments implementing successful programs, you export those programs across the borders of other countries. And that's the reach that large philanthropies have, which we as the research community or governments of nation states won't have.
Okay.
So I'll just kind of go in the order and make some thoughts. I couldn't agree with you more around the framing of, I think, how the narrative comes to women and children. I also want to add men and boys into that conversation as well around that. And so I think the absolute framing for us, for me, is you already are powerful. And part of the opportunity is to remove the barriers for you to exert that, feel that, and act on that. And that happens when you tell us what it is that is most needed. Second of all is in this notion of, and I didn't invent this, we're just trying to model it, of empowerment philanthropy. It is done with someone, not to someone, and it assumes that the individual already has agency, but there are factors which limit the ability for that agency to come to bear around that. And that can be as simple as transportation. It could be as complicated as bias around that. And that requires, in my opinion, a real humility in philanthropy, that things look really different in Guatemala than they might do in Niger, and they look really different in rural South Carolina than they might in areas of Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where moms still who are income insecure cannot get gestational care. So that's kind of how I think about that. And the behavior must match the narrative if we're going to change the narrative. So that's what I would respond to that. I really thank you for raising that. And thank you for letting me introduce both parenting dads and young boys as well in that piece. So Ellie, the way I would respond to this is I have yet to engage with young people or groups of young people who are very clearly, far and away thinking about community and society, in some cases far more thoughtfully than government or leadership is, and are deeply constrained around that voice and around action around that. And so it's one of the reasons we established the Center for Rising Generations. They are already leading. Could we just please give them the platform to do that at greater scale? And could we stop thinking that you must either get out of high school, get out of middle school, get out of college, or own a job before we can consider you as the leader around that? That is just such specious logic. Young people, I believe they're going to be there. And I say that is a belief and selfishly. I mean, I am going to get older in the future, and I need someone who's going to take care of me. And I need them to feel a deep sense of agency, knowledge, and the ability to lead communities. No young person wants to walk around any community and see what they see in the U.S. And we, not to come back to our own foundation, but one of the most amazing programs we run is what we call the Aspen Challenge. And we come to a community. We spend a year listening to the young people in the community. What is the biggest problem you have? Gather high schools and say, here are the 5 problems you told us. And invariably, it's unhoused, it's lack of employment, and then give all the resources we can bring together, create the problem. There have been youth after 9 weeks who have created an entirely different concept of shelter for the unhoused, a very different concept of what working means around that. And I just say that I found that as unlocking rather than judging. That's the piece I can think about that. You raised a really fascinating opportunity. So in my lifetime, which is not, 64 years, I've not known an event that so quickly involved the globe as the pandemic did, and was a real threat to human life around that, across that. What was so interesting for me to watch was there wasn't a lot of careful deliberation and strategy revisions and philanthropy thinking that it had to gather 500 different types of teams, from McKinsey to help them think about the right thing to do. We acted as humans. We acted in care of our fellow person and said that all those barriers, when they are removed and we can move quickly against an exogenous threat, we will make mistakes, we will have leakage in the use of the money, but we saw things like the fastest vaccination ever produced. We saw things like the deployment that overrode supply chain problems that were critical. I would want to say to you and those seemingly intractable problems that we see every day on the streets could be treated the exact same way if we chose to do that around that piece. Those are just my quick thoughts on the 3 questions that were put out there.
Thank you for those.
Good, thanks.
So you were hesitant at the beginning to mention one of your pillars. And since I have to bring it back to the Rockstar panel before us,
Yes.
how did...
We had AI write our entire strategy for
Yes.
us, and then we went out and did it. No, we kidding. We didn't do that.
So you have the answer to
We have
my
the answer
question.
to it.
Because...
Except that there were catfish involved in the picture.
So, because when we look at the continent and we look at the problems that are there, and if you were going to prioritize, one might not prioritize AI, given what we've heard, but one may also prioritize AI. And one question that has been running around my head around how African economies in particular balance their need for economic development, growth, job creation, industrialization with all the new technologies coming, AI with automation, climate actions with green efficiency. How did you decide what aspect of AI you want to drive philanthropic dollars towards?
Great question. Each pillar is based on something we want to understand deeper, which is also a little bit back to your point, as opposed to what we want to do. We want to understand first what we need to learn. And for us, what was coming up, since overwhelming majority of our work is young people, that there was a boatload of anecdotal information coming over the transom around longer engagement with an AI entity versus a teacher. In kind of the rapid rise of counseling done by an AI entity, there was really confounding information, albeit anecdotal. Youth are disclosing more to an AI entity than they might actually to an adult. So there was something about relationship that was taking place there. And so what we want to understand in our case was we sat down and said, rather than trying to figure out the problem to solve, what should we know more about so that investment down the road would be beneficial and have the least amount of unknown collateral harm around that. And that was relationship. And so some of our early investments right now are in trying to, I'll give an example of one. There is some really, in my opinion, fascinating development of what is the analog to a flight simulator, to a pilot, to a teaching simulator. And so just like we learned before, entities can scrape thousands of pieces of information. You can also scrape thousands of videos of teachers teaching and build an opportunity for me to enter this room, and what appears in front of me is 27 children, and they are children of any way you want to construct that. There are students in the class with exceptional abilities. There are students in the class with multiple languages, and I don't speak them. And you create that, and then you teach a lesson, and you get this interaction. It's just like I'm talking to you. And what's really fascinating is that then you come back with a group of people who saw you do that, and then you can analyze things that I would never know. That is the amount of time I acknowledged you by your first name, the amount of time I did not acknowledge you at all, the amount of time I looked over here, how many miscues I gave. Miscues is the greatest source of problem in teaching, and that is, I think I'm explaining it and you didn't understand exactly what I was offering. How many mistakes I make around that. That to me was really, really interesting. So the entity is actually improving the human to human interaction through a vehicle that previously was not possible. So there's an example of something we're trying to figure out. How does students, and I'll give another US example, there's just millions and millions and millions of federal dollars that go unspent in very specific areas of scholarship across the US. Our indigenous Native and First American communities do not access them anywhere near, and they're there for them. So building the knowledge through an entity is also another way around that.
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking, what is most important for our youth?
Yes.
At the end of the day, we want to create employment opportunities. We want to enable them to reach their full potential. And for me, I really want us to think about, if we are going to use these technologies, how can AI help to do that in their education? Because they need to be educated before they can even fully realize the potentials of AI. So if you're still thinking about how your AI strategy needs to rewrite itself, perhaps think along some of those youth areas. And in thinking about that, what would be the call to action for our audience? Because we've been here for the last couple of days. We're talking about how we can mobilize domestic philanthropic capital to work alongside yours, how it can be more targeted in the solutions that we're creating. What would you implore us to do, or what would you implore us to come to you to do?
So I don't actually believe that I should be giving a call to action to a place that's not my community, first and foremost. I think that the question is incredibly important. And is there a clarion call for action? And I think that should be generated for those closest to the opportunities and problems in community. And so I'm not ducking the question, but the thought that I might be arrogant to suggest that would be very problematic. In places where I've done that, that call has been, and I'll use, young people, for example. It is impossible to build a call to action without having young people at the table. It's impossible to build a call to action without actually them shaping what is affecting their lives. So the generality would be, if it's going to be transportation, people who cannot get transportation need to be part of that call to action. It's going to be healthcare, you get the idea around that piece. And having high wealth, ultra high wealth, philanthropy and government first listening before they construct or act was helpful for us as well around that. And then the last piece is, there is an obligation to wealth. There is an obligation to help others attain whatever the dream is for your country, just like our country, and to be clear about that, and to have honest and hard conversations about, you can't take it with you. It's just not going to be there, or at least in my world, when I go, it ain't coming. I don't have much to give, but it's still not coming. And the notion of, one thing is, we did a lot around the giving pledge. I pledge to give it away before I pass away. And then side by side thinking, is there a way that you can also tack on that this takes a long time? We don't seem to get really upset that it takes 15 years for one Alzheimer's drug to be produced, and that every 7 weeks we don't call it a failure because it hasn't been done yet. If we want to solve the issues of social, societal troubles, they're equally as complicated as an Alzheimer's drug. And celebrating the fact of persistence is as much as important as the breakthrough.
Great. So
I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
No, a lot of sense. A lot of sense. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to again give the chance to the audience to respond to what they've heard. And I see a mic with Mr. Dele Olojede. No, he's passing it along.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to go back to the call to action, which you didn't duck, but you kind of ducked, and maybe bring it to your community, actually. I'm really curious, and hopefully I'm not the only one who cares to learn about this. It does sound from what you're describing that the Bezos Family Foundation does take a very considered, careful, interesting, innovative, evolving approach to to, how it practices philanthropy. You've talked a little bit about the giving pledge, but beyond just getting, and we're probably all aware of, the legendary partnership between Gates and Buffett, and that is unraveling to some extent now. But beyond the giving pledge, beyond getting the uber rich to acknowledge that they do need to give, are you guys talking to each other to influence how you give? And hopefully you can tell us a bit more about, in your thinking, who are some of the equally progressive thinking foundations, and how are you exchanging these ideas? Because it matters. There's so much money at the table sitting in private foundations, and how it's deployed is as interesting as the fact that people are committing to deploy it in the first place.
That I feel very comfortable answering, because I could respond back home, so to speak. And if it works, extract it for another community or another country around that piece. Two very specific pieces to what you were saying. We, in kind of early, in trying to think through how best to give, have really become very comfortable with the notion of intermediaries, and that is giving to you to give. And so intermediaries currently exist. They're organizations that are deeply proximate to the local opportunity and dilemma. And quite frankly, instead of rolling into town and saying, we are going to do X, Y, and Z, you have been there for 15 years. The notion of, let us give this chunk of money to you, and then please tell us how you did that, and why you did that, and what happened around that, is very much this kind of tandem backseat of the piece. So existing, and we are building intermediaries around that. And I think that there is dignity when one approaches it that way. And that has been part of that. The second piece has been, I'm going to go back to the other gentleman's comment, is thinking deeply about what public-private partnerships might look like, and how philanthropy can both catalyze that and build those opportunities around that. We're not government. We shouldn't be government. We're also not a private organization. We're not like a bank or a public entity with stockholders. But we can serve as a bridge to bring those together. Some of the really thoughtful things in the U.S. have been really around housing and around really conception to 1,000 days after birth, around what that means for health and safety around those issues in terms of doing that. That does involve, what's the word I want to use? Having government think differently about how it gives in its categorical granting, and is there a way to bring seemingly two entities together and say, now you've got twice as much catalytic power and cash around those pieces. And a third is doubling down on structures that might need to be developed. So social impact bonds and social impact bonding is another example around that. I can only say this in my own language, really governmental incentives to give around that, and to celebrate and track that giving around that piece. That would be one way I would respond to that. And then the second part of the question I might respond to is the thought that it is perfectly okay to make bets and to make big bets. And if government is saying, I will absolve you from paying taxes on that, well, who else is going to do it? Yeah. That is exactly, so safe bets, I want safer bets when it comes to my vaccination, but I want really big bets when it comes to a social dilemma problem that might not be perfect. And we know the adage, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We need a lot more good in our communities. That's how I might think through that question. I love the question, thank you.
And there was a quote actually yesterday to make big bets, so it's all in line. Quick question.
John, just moving away from ultra wealthy philanthropy to just a culture of giving
Yes.
for relatively privileged people, I think one of the things that the US could export, and it always strikes me whenever I go there, is how people are taught from a pretty young age, if they get to college, get to a decent school, they've got to start giving straight away. And this whole notion that you've got to give back is so strong in the US, much stronger than anywhere else in the world. And it's certainly not strong in South Africa. I've tried to raise money for a number of institutions, and it's tough. But that culture doesn't exist. Have you got any thoughts about how one could try and expand that culture around the world?
I think of this through vehicles. I think there's an ethic to that you're right. It's talked about. It's quote instilled. But then there's vehicles to do it. So if it's an ethic without a vehicle, I don't think you get that action. So I'll give you two examples. Most organizations, we're one, I've worked in many of them, basically give every single employee X amount. It's $5,000, $10,000 a year for you to give away. And you choose the organizations you want to give, usually within a framework, and you make your giving every single year around that. Secondly, most organizations I know, and the one that we're in, says if you personally want to give up until a certain amount, we will match that around that piece. Those are vehicles to that. Then there's the training piece, which I'm just, I didn't come up with the idea, but I was able to make the idea happen. It came up with actually a group of parents when I was working in LA. And there's an organization that you can go online, and teachers all over the place post all the needs they have. And you can go on there and say, okay, so-and-so in PS 97 needs library books for astronomy. And I go on there and I give $115, and they're able to buy those library books. So what we did was we worked with Starbucks in LA, and that every time you went to Starbucks, you picked up a card that was already preloaded with money that you got to use on Donuts Choose, which was the name of the organization. And so we sold out thousands and thousands, so we had to replace them, and Starbucks got some coffee being bought at the same time around that. So if you went there and you bought something, you picked up a preloaded card, and then you practiced the art of philanthropy, even if it wasn't your own money. Of course, it's really difficult to go online and say, but they needed 150, I only have 75, all right, I'll throw the other 75 in, around that. And what we found out was that it was more than 50% were actually kids who were picking the cards up and doing it, as opposed to, we thought it would be 100% for adults. Those are just two examples of vehicles that were pretty fascinating to me on activating that ethic around that.
That's great, and I'll just,
Oh, yeah,
we're running out of time, but there are a couple of points you made earlier that I just want to sort of, again, just send out there for us all to think about. One of the top ones for me was philanthropy is done with someone, not to someone. You talked about an obligation to wealth. And I think if I put a wrap around and I think about a lot of the philanthropic capital, as you've spoken about it, we do need those incentives because people are allowed to do what they want to do with their own money. So thank you so much.
Thank
John.
you.
Right.
It was great. It was good to do it together. Thanks.